Hello and welcome to the Classics podcast as Virgil's Aeneid, with myself, Katrina Kelly.
And me, Caroline Lawrence.
It's lovely to be back. Thank you so much for joining us. And before we start this episode, we want to tell you all about the Classical Association's 2026 competition, which it's open to everyone, wherever you are, worldwide, of any age. You don't need to know anything about classics whatsoever. You just need to be feeling in a creative mood. Because the CA has teamed up with the Sir John Soanes Museum in London. And if you've ever been to London or lived there and want to go and visit the museum, it's free, it's fantastic, but you can also access that online catalogue. And we've selected 10 special objects from their collection, all of which have a classical theme. And we hope that you'll be inspired by them to compose some poetry. Be Virgil yourself. Don't worry, you don't have to be as meticulous as he was, as we've been describing on this podcast, but we still think you would produce something wonderful, whether it be a written poem or spoken word. So enjoy looking through these images. Select the one that inspires you most. You could pick a couple because you can submit a couple of poems and tell us all about it. Caroline, which would you pick if this was your entry into the competition?
Well, I liked two of them. And I like haikus because they're really short. And I try to do one a day. It's my kind of way of journaling. I do a little haiku. Um, and I tried to do one there's a wonderful cork model of a little temple near the River Tiber. But that wasn't the Temple of Good Luck. But I didn't have any luck with that one. I wrote about the little Cupid, a little broken Cupid, and I wrote a haiku. I mean, your poem can be quite long. It can be any format. It can be free verse. It can be a sonnet, whatever. And for a haiku, it doesn't have to be brilliant. But here's mine anyway. It's the little sleeping Cupid, and he's quite kind of broken. So my haiku was, "Don't wake this little Cupid, crudely sculpted and broken. Let him dream." And that's got your 5 syllables, your 7, and your 5.
And I wonder what he is dreaming about. It is a beautiful little image. So we hope that you will submit your entries because you've got until the end of February. There's several months to get going and thinking about this, but you've got to be in it to win it because there are lots of cash prizes available. So make sure that you enter now. I love the apotheosis of Homer because it fits in so nicely with what we've been talking about on the podcast and where Homer is being elevated to this divine status. And I think Virgil would really have something to say about that. And he's surrounded by the muses who we've loved talking about. So I think that would be the one that would inspire me most. But we can't wait to receive your entries. So please do enter our poetry competition, Verse and Voice, and you can find all the details on the Classical Association website. Okay, so last week we had our pater episode. We hope you enjoyed it. And we said at the end that our word of the day this week might need you to bring the tissues with you. It appears in a famous saying of Virgil's, that again you might have heard, lacrimae rerum, often translated as events have tears.
So yes, our word for today is lacrimae, which is a plural noun that means tears. And a useful mnemonic way to remember that is, the little tiny gland on the inside of your eye. It's a little organ. It's called the lacrimal gland, and that's what produces tears. And I'll never forget, I used to teach Latin at primary school, and I had one boy with impaired vision, and he had to go to Moorfields Eye Hospital a lot. And he loved Latin, and he came back. He said, "Miss Caroline, they had a sign that said lacrimal, and I knew what it meant from Latin."
Oh, that's so wonderful.
So, do you want to decline it?
I will. And first, it reminds me of I loved as a child the series of unfortunate events books by Lemony Snicket, and they have a Lake Lachrymose in it. I mean, that whole series is full of tears, in a slightly dark, comedic kind of way. But that was I remember going, I know what that means because of Latin. So let's do the whole thing, singular as well as plural. So lacrima, lacrima, lacrimam, lacrimae, lacrimae, lacrima, in the plural. Again, lacrimae, lacrimae, lacrimas, lacrimarum, lacrimis, lacrimis. It's a really simple noun that goes like puella, one of those others that you would learn early on.
Quella
And
osmensa.
indeed. And it's kindred with the ancient Greek word for tear, isn't it, Caroline?
Yeah, which is dacruon, often shortened to dacru. So you just got lacru, dacru. Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, and there's loads of words in Latin for tears. I mean, they love loads of words for killing and for crying. Fletus is another one.
Yeah,
Gutta means the kind of teardrop itself, doesn't it?
yes. And often I think we'll see example of just a flood came from his eyes. He doesn't even say what, but we know what it is. And Aeneas people have called him a stick, I think I said last week, or a chump, but he's very emotional and he weeps a lot. And just this morning, I flitted through very quickly to see if I could count how many times he weeps. And it's at least 8 or 9 times in the Aeneid. He cries. But the first occurrence is in book 1, line 462, when Aeneas has just arrived in Carthage and he's still hidden by a cloud of invisibility. And he's studying these frescoes on the wall of the Temple of Juno. And that's when he says, Sunt lacrimae rerum. And it's quite a tricky passage. Do you want to read it for us in Latin?
I'll give it my best shot. So it starts from line 459. Constitit et lacrimans, quis iam locus inquit acate, quae regio in terris nostri non plena laboris, enpriamus, sunt hic etiam sua primi laudi, sunt lacrimae rerum et mentem mortalia tangunt, solve metus, ferret haec aliquam tibi fama salutem, sic ait, atque animum pictura pascet inani, multa gemens, lago quae umectat flumini voltum. He stood weeping. What place, Achates, he said, or what kingdom on earth is not full of our suffering? Look, there is Priam. Even here his achievements are praised. Events inspire tears, and transient tales touch the heart. Don't be afraid. This fame will bring you a measure of protection. That's what he said, and he fed his heart with the empty images, mourning many things, and wet his face with a large flood of tears.
Of tears, understood. A lot of tears in that passage. One of my favorite films is The Big Lebowski. And Lebowski says to the dude, strong men also cry. Strong men also cry. But
As
back to
indeed they
Virgil.
should, nothing to be ashamed of.
Heroes, you show your emotion, especially if you're in Italy. So in our previous podcast, we talked about the 2 schools of thought concerning Virgil's Aeneid that I just discovered doing this podcast. The so-called European optimists who believed the Aeneid, that it was a brilliant masterpiece praising the new Emperor Augustus and one that might even have inspired him to greatness. And the Harvard pessimists who believed that while it seemed to be a panegyric, it was actually a darkly subversive work for anyone with eyes to see. So, of course, this is all academic. I mean, in every sense of the word, these are academics having their little discussions. But some of these very erudite essays are by men and women who know the poem so well, better than you or I, and they love it and often show us why it's a great masterpiece of Western civilization among all these little arguments they make. And one of those scholars who obviously adored Virgil was Adam Parry, an American born in Paris but raised in California. And although technically a founder member of the Harvard pessimists, he comes at it from a new angle, arguing that there are actually 2 voices in Virgil, not necessarily the pro or Augustan one, but rather the public and the private voice of the poet. And a Virgil scholar I really respect, Susanna Brown, wrote that she wrote, if there is one single scholarly intervention that shifted our view of the Aeneid, it was surely Adam Parry's essay, The 2 Voices of Virgil's Aeneid. But before I talk about this groundbreaking author, do you want to tell us a little bit about Adam Parry?
Yeah, so as you say, one of the so-called Harvard pessimists, but the connection that's even more interesting was that he was the son of Milman Parry, who we mentioned way back when we were talking about the Cano episode, about the opening lines of the Aeneid and the bards involved in singing ancient epic oral poetry. Because Milman Parry was that brilliant classicist who studied traditional Yugoslav oral poetry, to better understand how the oral poetry of Homer would have worked. And so he was one of the first scholars who proposed that the Iliad and the Odyssey were the product and the evolution of voices over time, not just one person. And Milman Parry had a tragic short life, and at the age of only 33, he died of a gunshot wound to his heart. Whether it was accidental, self-inflicted, or murder, we will never know. And his son Adam was only 5 when he died, and so he too followed in his father's footsteps with his classical interest, and then sadly he also had a short life and a tragic end. And he died along with his wife in a motorbike accident in France when he was 43. So more tears.
It's amazing. I find as I'm delving into these, the personality of some of the scholars comes through, and they're so fascinating, some of them. Really, really interesting. Anyway, Parry's argument about the two voices of Virgil's Aeneid brings together the two schools we've been talking about together. He talks about the public voice of triumph and the private voice of regret. And he begins his article quite poetically by saying that sometimes you can reread a passage of poetry you know well, but suddenly it's as if you're seeing it for the first time and you get a kind of revelation or an epiphany. And he says this happened to him while reading just a line and a half from the end of book 7. And of course, we know that the most popular books are books 2, 4, and 6. The beginning, the first half of the Aeneid, people don't get into the back half very often, but book 7's quite an obscure book. But he focuses in on this line and a half. And he, first of all, he spends several pages just unpacking the brilliance of it. And the line is, te nemus angitiae vitrea te fucinis unda, te liquidi flevere lacus. And this is, as I said, a line and a half. This half line is one of about 50 or so half lines that show that the Aeneid probably was unfinished. Though some of these half lines are quite powerful for not being finished. Would you like to read that again? I just read it, but if you want to read it and translate it.
So the grove of Angitiae wept for you, and Fucinus of the glassy wave, and the
Yep.
liquid lakes. In
Oh,
brackets, they wept for you, Umbro.
yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you. Yeah, it's so short, but you can see just looking at it, it's beautifully composed. And here's Parry's translation. He says, "For you the grove of Angitiae mourned, and Fucinus's glassy waters and the clear lakes." And he first talks about the rhetorical devices that Virgil uses in this line and a half. Um, Devices would have been known to Quintilian or Cicero, and anyone who did higher education, any young man who did higher education in ancient Rome would have studied rhetoric, all these little devices. And first of all, he talks about tricolon, which is the repetition of three things, but in a slightly different fashion. And then he talks about asyndeton. There's no and word, no joining word like and or but. And then he talks about apostrophe, which is one of my favorites, where you address someone directly. And Parry, I mean, you can just see it by looking at it. He talks about how he uses to and te and puts them in different parts of the line and balances it all out. And he says that this short passage excels in more than rhetoric. It's the beautiful way it's employed. And he's after his analysis, he says, if this analysis seems too microcosmic, let me say that Virgil may not be, surely is not the greatest poet who ever lived, but that in this mastery of the disposition of words within a formal pattern, he has no rivals. So Virgil's the greatest poet in the world for putting words together, which is, and as we know, Virgil often spent a day on 2 lines, licking them into shape like a mother bear. Now, this short passage, this little brief little passage, appears in book 7, in which a tame deer is killed by Ascanius. I think we mentioned that, didn't we?
We did in our podcast on Curva, when we were talking about Dido as the deer. And that's when one of the Furies, sent by Juno, orchestrates this hunting accident, and then Juno herself opens the gates of war. some things that the contemporary Roman readers would know about the gates of war in Rome themselves, summoning the various tribes in Italy to muster against Aeneas and his band of refugees. And then Virgil artfully names each group as they march out to battle Aeneas in a passage which therefore very much resembles, although it's way better, the catalogue of ships and then the catalogue of heroes at the end of Book 2 of the Iliad. So a nice Homeric connection there.
Yeah, so again, he's riffing on Homer, but he's making it completely his own. And so he's got the procession of all the local Latins, the people who lived in Italy at that time, but different tribes with their own different unique qualities, who are called out. And near the end of the procession, not the very end, that's saved for someone special, but near the end of the procession, Virgil names this kind of obscure priest named Umbro, who, if he's not made up, was certainly not very well known. And he's never named before or after. And he comes from a beautiful part of Italy to the east of Rome called Maruvium. And this region had only just lost its independence from Rome about a generation before Virgil. So it lost its freedom. They gained citizenship, but at the cost of losing their freedom. But Umbro is a priest. His special gift or talent was he could heal snake bites, and he could talk to snakes and do things with snakes. So he's a kind of healer priest. And as he marches out, Virgil laments his death before they've even arrived at the battlefield. And Virgil says, Sed no Dardaniae medicari cuspis ictum evaluit. But he was not able to hear the blow of a Trojan, that's Dardaniae, spear. And that enjambment, that last word, means to heal. He couldn't heal the own blow to himself. And but what Virgil does is he tells it from the point of view of the lakes and the trees and the groves of the land. And we know Virgil loved Italy and he loved the land. He wrote the eclogues and the Georgics about rural Italy and then about cultivated Italy. And but what he does is he has them addressing umbo. And this is one of my favorite little rhetorical devices, apostrophe, when a character addresses someone, when the poet addresses someone directly. He's kind of breaking the fourth wall. And I was just wondering, does Homer ever do that, where he kind of talks to somebody or talks to the reader?
He does a few times. I mean, very, very scarcely comparing the whole length of his works, but 8 times he uses it to address Patroclus in book 16 of the Iliad. So that's during both his Aristeia, that's the moment where he's kind of rampaging successfully, and then in his death as well. And actually, so it was Milman Parry, the dad, who believed that apostrophes in Homer were strictly just for metrical purposes. They didn't have the kind of extra meaning to them. Whereas Adam thought differently. And there's a great article that you can read if you're interested in finding out a bit more about that quite technical side of things.
Yeah, so I think I've noticed even before, when Virgil addresses somebody, he kind of stops and almost talks to the character in the poem. It's a really interesting situation. It's either a god, or it's when the character is maybe about to die or dead. It's almost as if they're in a liminal space between fiction and reality, or death and life. It's so fascinating. So watch out if Virgil addresses you directly. You don't want him to do that. It means you're going to die soon.
Yes, and I have one more example that we're going to come to a bit later of this.
Okay, good. And it was this passage, this line and a half, that just opened Parry's eyes to the pervasive notes of melancholy and nostalgia, because although he shows how beautiful the rhetoric is, he talks about how it just, the words, the descriptions Virgil uses evoke a melancholy. And Parry writes this: if we could understand wholly the reasons for this lamentation, so elaborate in its brevity, and what makes it so poignant and why it is so Virgilian, we should, I think, have grasped much of Virgil's art.
Yeah, and lots of commentators, but especially those who are also writers or poets themselves, really pick up on this pervasive sadness. So, Matthew Arnold, in his inaugural lecture when he was the Oxford Professor of Poetry in 1857, he said that there was an ineffable melancholy and a sweet, touching sadness in the Aeneid. I think partly because to him, Aeneas's opponents are brave and are unfortunate as well, just as much as the protagonists of the poem. There is sympathy on both sides.
That was in 1857. That's amazing. And the Aeneid is soaked in sadness because, again, Aeneas is not a free agent like Odysseus or Achilles. He's a pawn of the gods with a destiny which he can reject, but he doesn't reject it. And he has to forego all his personal desires for the greater good, one which he won't even see with his own eyes.
Yeah, and because he shows this humanitas that we've talked about, the link closely to Clementia and to pietas, clemency and piety, and he shows revulsion at bloodshed. In book 10, he regrets killing Lausus, and then at Pallas's funeral in book 11, he says, I would have wished to grant it, i.e., peace, to the living. And there's a real melancholy. The more you kind of think and reread that line, there's a real deep melancholy to it, isn't it? Um, I was reading some of the poetry of Clive James recently, the kind of the commentator, and he wrote a selection called "Sentenced to Life" instead of "Sentenced to Death," and it kind of taps into that deep melancholy with life and living and everything around it.
Yeah, it's the human condition. I didn't know Clive James wrote poetry. I'll have to check that out. So Parry, he argues that the only pleasure Aeneas seems to get is in remembering his suffering, because there's that line in Aeneid 1, line 203, Forsan et haec olim meminisse juvabit. Perhaps one day it will be a pleasure to remember these things. That's when he's again looking at this fresco on the wall of the fall of Troy, and he feeds his soul on the futile scenes at quanimum pictura pascit inani.
Yeah, and when I read that line just at the beginning, when we read that whole passage, it's the rhythm of that line really sticks out. The p sounds, but also pasket is it's kind of a visceral verb to use. Feasts his eyes. It's got this kind of longing, isn't it? A really greedy, raw emotion. So it's a
Yeah,
great word.
and the images are inani, inanis, which means empty, carrying no burden, no weight, and yet we love images. We encourage ourselves on images, don't we? We love pictures and stories and moving pictures. But that brings us nicely back to our initial quote of sunt lacrimae rerum, I think. And Parry, in his article about the pervasive, these two voices, the private voice of regret, it's a really deep article, and I didn't understand it all or agree with some of the bits I did understand, but it's really worth reading, and it's easily available. Just Google the two voices of Virgil, and you'll find it there. It's in several places for free. But it does show what a complex work of art the Aeneid is. It's not binary. It's not even the private voice of regret and the public voice of triumph. It's or the pro-Augustan and the it's many layers. And Stephanie Quinn, who wrote this amazing book that I'm just loving, big old collection of essays about Virgil's Aeneid. I'll just show it to you because it's got the golden bow on the cover. Why Virgil? She says, Virgil's gift to our times as to others is to teach us a way to see the world in turmoil, to hold many visions of it simultaneously, excruciatingly, all in absolute conflict with each other, and all of them true. So, with that in mind, let's look at the powerful and shocking ending of the Aeneid, which we've been promising we would do for ages. Do you want to set the scene?
Yeah, we have been promising. We've been dallying around it for ages, so we're going to come to the end, to book 12. And this is where, so the Latin warrior Turnus, we've mentioned him lots of times, Aeneas' opponent for the last third, pretty much, of the Aeneid. He's finally been vanquished in single combat with Aeneas. They've had this duel, though Aeneas did have to have supernatural help, as we know. Is he the strongest hero? Well, he has divine support at this stage. Juno has finally told Jupiter that she will let him found his new Troy as long as he and his followers don't call themselves Trojans anymore. So this is going to be that process of assimilation. We see Turnus kneeling wounded in the dust before Aeneas with his arms outstretched, admitting defeat, begging for mercy. They've both been manipulated by the gods. He's in pain and exhausted, Aeneas, and he stands panting above Turnus, who is also exhausted. So this is the very end, like line 929. And this is what we get. Ille humiliis supplex oculus dextramque precantem protendens, equidum merui nec deprico inquit. Utera sorti tua misere te siqua parentis tangere cura potest. Oro fuit et tibitalis Anchiasis genitor, downi misere senectae, et me seu corpus spoliatum lumini mevis, redimeis. Vicisti et victum tendere palmas ausoniae videre, tua est Lavinia conjunx, ulterius ne tende oidius. Stetic acer in armis Aeneas, volvens oculos, dextram cere pressit, et iamque magis cunctantem flectere sermo coeperat.
Lots of familiar words there and concepts. Here's my translation. A humble suppliant, Turnus, stretches his eyes and pleading right hand and says, "Truly I deserve this, and I do not plead to avoid it. Use your advantage, but I beg you, if any compassion for a poor parent is able to reach you, for you had such a parent in Anchises, pity my old father Daunus, and return me, or if you prefer, my body drained of light, to my family. You have won, and my people have seen me stretch out my hands, a loser. Lavinia is your wife. Do not extend your hatred any further." Aeneas stood fierce in his armor, turning his eyes in thought. He held back his deadly right hand, and more, Turnus's plea began to move him as he hesitated. ...
We'll come to the next line in a minute. In that, we've had so many references to eyes again. We've had the word lumina, meaning eyes but light of life here. Earlier, Turnus then stretched out his eyes, and then that part at the end, volvens oculos, where Aeneas is rolling his eyes, and that's gonna perhaps be part of his decision making.
Yeah, that's fascinating because again, you have that concept that we've lost of eye beams of the extra mission, and he stretches out. He's really intently looking at Aeneas. And what's fascinating to me is that psychologists say you can tell whether someone's a dominant right or left brain by where they put their eyes when they think, whether they roll them up to the right. But he's obviously thinking, and different translators, if you look in different translations, some of them have him gazing into the middle distance, and it's really fascinating to see. And I have to confess, I don't think we understand all the nuances of what this would have meant to an ancient Roman. The only time, and the word is volvens, oculus, literally rotating your eyes. The only other time this happens, I believe, in the Aeneid is Dido in book 4, line 363, when she's struggling with her emotions as Aeneas is preparing to leave. But that's a dangerous rabbit hole, so let's go back to this passage. Turnus is submitting. He's stretching out his right hand, and we know from oil lamps that that's the sign a gladiator would have made, begging for mercy. So that would have been familiar to many Romans. He's invoking Aeneas' sympathy for his pater Daunus. You've got the father-son thing going again. He's invoking Anchises. He uses the word oro, I beg. He says, you've won, I'm the loser. You've got Lavinia. Everything he's saying shows his submission. And as Aeneas hesitates, moved more and more, and here an instantation where cunctantem, hesitating, this is an instant where that word seems to be a good thing.
Exactly. This is going to be the moment where Aeneas shows off his clementia, his piety again. And then he spots a piece of armour taken from Pallas, whom he's loved as a son, and was charged with looking after, and then, fired by fury and terrible in anger, he buries his sword, condit, ferrum the iron sword, condit, and condit is the same word used in the beginning of the Aeneid, if we go all the way back to Book 1, to found Rome. It's a great connection, really. It gives us this full circle, isn't it? Full arc. And he buries this sword in Turnus's breast. His soul descends reluctantly to the underworld with a groan. So it's that direct link. Something has been triggered in his brain and in his heart because he's now avenging the death of Pallas, which we could argue and argue over that could be justified. And even if anger isn't quite perhaps the sin in the way we'd see it today, that the way he executes Turnus, it's still showing a lack of control. It's something the Stoics we were mentioned in our bonus episode, they would have condemned. And Brooks Otis, to go back to one of the scholars we mentioned last week, argued that Turnus had to die. Like, he must atone for the sins that he's shown previously in the story. Whereas somebody on the opposing side of the argument, Putnam, he argued that this act shows that Aeneas is submitting again to forces greater than himself and allowing himself to be dictated not just by emotion, but by a different kind of external pressure. So, Caroline, am I right in thinking that the European optimists would say that this action is totally justifiable, it's what the Romans would have done, they'd applaud, whereas again the Harvard pessimists would be saying that this undermines the pro-Roman stance that we've been seeing throughout the Aeneid?
Yes, exactly. And I think that this is always the clincher, this final dramatic scene. And many of them, the fact that so many commentators from the 4th century, Donatus and Servius, to the present defend his behavior with eloquent arguments, the very fact they have to defend him shows how shocking this was, even to ancient readers. And of course, the thing that makes this passage really shocking is that the Aeneid just ends right here. The abruptness highlights his savage execution of a humble suppliant. There aren't any funeral games for the dead. Both the Iliad and the Odyssey end kind of in medias res, but it's a kind of low-key scene. There's no, at last, the way was clear for Aeneas to build his new kingdom, or even less, then Aeneas married Lavinia and they lived happily ever after. There's none of that. And so it's quite shocking, isn't it?
Yeah, like in a film, this is like a cut to black, right? This is no text afterwards, or they all lived happily ever after, or even the end. This is it would have been quite shocking. And especially when you consider how the rest of Book 12 has been built up, because it's been very formalised in the manner we'd expect, really, from epic, that there's a truce, and then there's a planned duel, and then the truce is broken wrongly, and Aeneas is still trying to restrain his anger. So there's a quote about that, about line 313. And then he's wounded. Then his mood naturally starts to sour. He has a wound, so think back to Dido and how her Saucia, her love wound, poisoned her mind as well as her body over time. And then he suddenly switches, Aeneas, to becoming avidus, so greedy, desiring of battle. And there's also, because we love similes on this podcast, and even though we can't talk through them all day, even though we'd love to, there is an incredible simile, which you can go and look, which describes Aeneas' return to battle around line 450, where he's raging, he's in this engulfing storm cloud against the Italian farmers. It's a kind of very rustic scene, posing nature against humans. And this is where we go back to the apostrophe, because Virgil adds in this little bit to describe the farmers as miserius heu, like, oh, hey, you miserable ones, where he's directly addressing them, as you said, Caroline, in the moment before they're about to suffer, something bad is going to happen to them. And it's this sort of Virgilian voice of pity for the wretched Italians who were destined in this story to be the losers.
Yeah, and I love the cloud simile. Again, we got that in the funeral races. Remember that the runners are going like a cloud. So Virgil obviously had a thing about clouds, but yeah, the ending is so abrupt that many scholars actually used this abrupt ending as an argument that he hadn't finished it and he was going to tie it up. But and this is one of the passages he might have reworked, isn't it?
Yeah, maybe so. And in the 1400s, an Italian guy called Maffeo Veggio he wrote a final book of the Aeneid in the style of Virgil, very clever, tying up all the loose ends. It's kind of fan fiction to the utmost. I don't know what Virgil would have thought of that. And maybe this all was part of the plan. It certainly is a shocking ending that gives you those doubts, the ambiguity that has been there throughout to be your final takeaway.
But the fact that it's 12 books, it's beautiful. Was he going to have a 13th book? That for me, the shocking abruptness of it means the ambiguity is the genius of it, that it means it will be talked about in every generation. And you mentioned Cut to Black, and it actually made me think of the shocking ending of the Sopranos TV series, that series about the American mafiosa in New Jersey, and a massively respected series by David Chase. And the final episode, many people were tuning in, and suddenly, apparently in the middle of the scene, it just goes black. And many people thought there'd been a power cut. And then finally, after 2 minutes or so, the credits start to come, and people were outraged and confused, and there was so much talk on the internet. And I think that's the way David Chase wanted it, and I think that might have been the way Virgil wanted it.
And that's what makes for a great piece of art, is that it causes confusion or anxiety or disruption and gets people talking. So just to go back to Turnus, and I think another disturbing part of the death is when we think back to the advice that Anchises gave to Aeneas in the Underworld in Book 6. And in fact, Turnus, as we said, mentions Anchises, which makes us remember that, as well as reinforcing the father-son relationship and trying to build in some passion and compiti in his plea. So he says, Tu regere imperio populos Romanae memento, hae tibi errantates, pacisque imponere morem, parcere subjectis, et debellare superbos.
Yeah, I translated it like this. But you, Roman, he addresses Aeneas as a Roman. This is the father talking to Aeneas. Remember to rule peoples with power. These shall be your skills, to lay guidelines for peace, to spare those who submit, but pound the proud.
Pound the proud. That's great. And by addressing Aeneas as Roman, it's as if Anchises / Virgil is addressing Augustus. Spare the defeated here, Augustus.
Yes, yes. In fact, it could be that at the end of the poem, he's still speaking to Augustus, the man who commissioned this, and Virgil's saying, you shocked us before with your prescriptions, Caesar, and now see how shocking your ancestors' behavior is here, to slaughter just one suppliant. Don't be like him. And in our podcasts of Pius and Pater, I wondered if Aeneas was Virgil's alter ego, and I think we've agreed he is. But Aeneas is also the alter ego of Augustus, and we've seen he can be fierce like Achilles, and many people think he's an alter ego of Achilles. And he's like Odysseus too, who can also get angry. And since Parry published his article, the one we've been talking about, The Two Voices, most scholars agree there's no binary in Virgil. It's all shades of truth, sometimes in absolute conflict with each other. So perhaps Aeneas is Virgil, and he's also Augustus, and he's also Achilles, and he's maybe you and maybe me and anyone who's ever read the poem.
Yeah, and Virgil's saying to Augustus and also to us, the reader, that you should consider, you should doubt, you should hesitate, cunctantem, that this is what Pius Aeneas did. So what would you do in that same situation? And he reminds us the importance. I always love the fact that amor, love, the Latin word for love, is an anagram of Roma, of the place that Aeneas is headed. I mean, that's just coincidence, but it's the fact that this is an act to do with love. Aeneas's heart is brought to furor and frenzy and madness, just like Dido, because of the the fatherly love that he's feeling towards Pallas in that moment is what incenses him. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? And these are all thoughts for us to consider.
And it's Virgil, the poet, who took on the commission, who said, I will write this poem for Augustus. And we know he did readings to Augustus during the composition of it. So he's reading it. And I wonder if Virgil's poem didn't actually set the tone for the good works that Augustus would go on to accomplish. Because you had the bold, vindictive, brash young Octavian became an emperor who would rule wisely and even conservatively over 40 years, ushering in a period of peace and stability, and eventually, as you pointed out last week, yes, 2 decades after the death of Virgil, but Augustus takes the title Pater Patriae, the father of the fatherland. And was this Virgil's influence? Was Aeneas a kind of ended up being a cautionary tale as much as a panegyric? And was Virgil the true author of the Augustan age? I like to think so. And I actually came across Robert Gervil, who wrote about the shield. He writes that Virgil gave Augustus and his regime political interpretation, meaning, and import. And just think if a poet or a writer or a screenwriter today could inspire a world leader to rule justly and well, and in so doing, set the tone for a new golden age. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Wouldn't it just? I mean, have we persuaded you? Are you still out there feeling like a Harvard pessimist? Would you argue differently? Would you, in fact, point to Augustus's Res Gestae, which is put up in all of these different monuments across the Roman Empire as a sign of cohesion and community and emphasizing all the amazing things he says he's done, just before his death? So after the Aeneid has been out for a while, it's not the best written though. It's certainly he is no Virgil himself, and he does just like to emphasize all of the incredible achievements he's made. It's very, very egotistical and personal. So was he influenced by Virgil? Did that add to his narrative, or is there another interpretation out there that you'd like to share with us, or you think differently? Do let us know.
Yeah, we'd love to hear. And I don't think it was too tearful, though we had tears. It wasn't too tearful an episode. But next week, we have a much more colorful word, literally, the word purpureus, or purple.
I'm really looking forward to it. And also, we're going to give a shout out to Lavinia, who we just mentioned there, that Turnus mentions the future mother of Rome, Aeneas' wife to be, in that final speech. So we're going to come to Lavinia when we're talking about colours, and perhaps we'll feature a few other of the women of the Aeneid.
And we might be a little bit erotic, too.
If that hasn't enticed you to come back for more next week, I don't know what will. Thank you so much for listening. Please make sure that you like and subscribe. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, it's been lovely to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time on the Classics podcast, Does Virgil's Aeneid?